He was an 8-month-old baby boy when a routine surgery went horribly wrong. In desperation, his parents agreed to raise him as a girl on the advice of a famous psychologist, while his identical twin brother was raised as a boy. This secret experiment led to unimaginable pain, shocking the world with its tragic outcome. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we delve into one of the most emotionally powerful and psychologically gripping true stories you'll ever hear. It's the haunting tale of David Reimer, the boy who was forced to live as a girl. Our story begins in Winnipeg, Canada in 1965. Janet and Ron Reimer were a young working-class couple who had just welcomed healthy twin baby boys, Bruce and Brian. Their lives seemed ordinary and happy, until a medical mishap changed everything. In 1966, when the twins were about 8 months old, both boys were diagnosed with phimosis, a minor condition where the foreskin has trouble retracting. Doctors recommended a simple circumcision to fix the issue. It was supposed to be a routine procedure. But during Bruce's surgery, something went terribly wrong. The surgeon, using an electric cauterizing needle instead of a scalpel, accidentally burned baby Bruce's penis beyond repair. This was not a small injury. It was a life-altering accident. The Reimers were devastated and desperate. How would their boy live a normal life after such a tragedy? With baby Bruce gravely injured and no reliable reconstructive surgery available at the time, the distraught parents sought help anywhere they could. One night they happened to see a television interview with Dr. John Money, a renowned psychologist and sexologist from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Money was a charismatic, Harvard-educated expert, famous for pioneering the concept of gender identity in the 1960s. He believed that nurture could override nature, that how a child is raised is more important than biology in determining gender. On the TV program, Dr. Money described his successful cases of sex reassignment for infants born with ambiguous genitalia. He confidently claimed he could turn a child into whichever sex seemed appropriate, with surgery and hormones, resulting in happy, healthy children. To the Reimers, this sounded like a lifeline. Here was an esteemed doctor essentially telling them, "Your baby's future can still be saved. Just raise him as a her." After contacting Dr. Money, Janet and Ron traveled to Baltimore to meet him. Dr. Money urged them to opt for a radical solution: change Bruce's sex entirely and raise him as a girl. He argued that Bruce was young enough that his gender identity was neutral and malleable. If they removed Bruce's damaged male genitalia, constructed a form of female genitalia, and strictly raised the child as a girl, Dr. Money believed Bruce would grow up fully identifying as female. He advised them never to tell the child about his birth as a boy. It was an almost unthinkable proposition, essentially making their son become their daughter. But the Reimers truly just wanted to do the right thing for their child. They feared Bruce might otherwise face a life of ridicule or misery. Trusting the expert and clinging to hope, they agreed to Dr. Money's experiment. In 1967, at 22 months old, Bruce Reimer underwent sex reassignment surgery. At Johns Hopkins, his testes were removed. and surgeons fashioned a crude vaginal structure. Bruce was renamed Brenda, and the Reimers brought their toddler home to begin life as a girl. At first, everything seemed okay on the surface. Dr. Money was proud of what he called the John Joan case. John Doe, Jane Doe, to keep it anonymous. In the early years, he reported the outcome as a resounding success. Proof that nurture trumped nature. In fact, he wrote in 1975 that the child preferred dresses to pants and was happily adjusting to the female role. Time magazine even touted Brenda's story as evidence that traditional gender roles could be changed. For a while, the world believed the experiment worked. But behind closed doors, the reality was very different. From a young age, Brenda did not feel or behave like a girl at all. At home, she gravitated toward more stereotypically boyish toys like trucks and guns, rather than dolls. In one telling incident, Janet Reimer put her toddler in a pretty dress, and Brenda immediately tried to tear it off in fury. She knows she's a boy and she doesn't want girls' clothing. Janet thought anxiously at the time. The signs of Brenda's discomfort were there from the start. As Brenda grew, the conflicts only intensified. She had a masculine gait and attitude that other kids picked up on. In school, young Brenda was bullied relentlessly. Classmates teased her for being different, for walking, talking, and even urinating more like a boy than a girl. On one occasion, when she tried to stand while using the girls' bathroom, not understanding why girls had to sit, the other girls mocked and even threatened her with a knife. Little Brenda couldn't understand what she was doing wrong, only that she was an outcast. At home, the Reimer twins were an interesting contrast. Brenda was actually physically stronger and more aggressive than her brother Brian. Brian later said, "I recognized Brenda as my sister, but she never, ever acted the part," noting that Brenda simply didn't behave like a typical girl. These differences baffled and worried her parents. Janet Reimer later admitted she had quiet doubts about the gender change over the years, seeing her child resist feminine things. "But I couldn't afford to contemplate them. I couldn't afford to be wrong," she said. They were all in on Dr. Money's experiment, for better or worse. Throughout childhood, Brenda and Brian were brought to annual follow-ups with Dr. Money, who was eager to document the success of his case. But those visits became deeply traumatic for the twins. Dr. Money's methods were invasive and, by today's standards, extremely unethical. He would show the young children explicit sexual images and push Brenda to accept a female identity and anatomy. In later interviews, both David, formerly Brenda, and Brian accused Dr. Money of forcing them into sexual rehearsal play, essentially making the twins simulate sexual acts with each other during therapy sessions. The doctor claimed this was meant to reinforce gender roles, but it left the Reimer twins horrified and confused. It was abuse masquerading as science. Brenda's mental and emotional health deteriorated under these pressures. At home, the family was falling apart. The strain of keeping this huge secret and watching their child struggle was immense. Brenda's father sank into alcoholism, unable to cope with the guilt and confusion. Her mother, Janet, became severely depressed. At one point she attempted suicide because of the overwhelming despair. And although Brian was being raised normally as a boy, he felt the fallout too. He couldn't understand why his twin was so unhappy. In their teen years, Brian began to have his own troubles, turning to drugs and battling mental illness. He would later be diagnosed with schizophrenia. This family was living through a nightmare, all caused by a well-intentioned but disastrous experiment. Dr. Money, however, saw none of this, or chose not to. He praised the case publicly for years, holding it up as proof that a boy could indeed be turned into a girl, with the right upbringing. Meanwhile, Brenda was quietly reaching a breaking point. By age 13, she was so miserable that she threatened to commit suicide if her parents ever made her see Dr. Money again. Unbeknownst to Dr. Money, Brenda had even refused to continue the estrogen hormone treatments prescribed to help her develop as female. She was, in her heart, done living this lie. Finally, the Reimers realized they could no longer hide the truth from their child. Brenda's psychologist in Winnipeg urged that she had a right to know what had happened. In 1980, when Brenda was 14 years old, Ron and Janet decided to tell her everything. Ron Reimer picked a quiet moment to unburden himself of the secret. After a tense counseling session, he took Brenda and twin brother Brian out for a drive. They stopped at a local ice cream parlor, a place that normally brings children joy, but now it was the setting for a life-changing revelation. There, Ron broke down and confessed the truth to his child. Brenda had been born a boy named Bruce and was physically altered and raised as a girl because of a terrible accident. Imagine the shock and confusion that 14-year-old must have felt in that moment. But above all, Brenda felt relief. As she later described it, "Suddenly, it all made sense why I felt the way I did. I wasn't some sort of weirdo. I wasn't crazy." Learning that she had been born male lifted an immense weight off her shoulders. For the first time, her lifelong feelings of not fitting in were being validated by reality. It wasn't her fault at all. Brenda immediately rejected her female identity. Within weeks of learning the truth, she announced that she was taking back her original gender. Brenda cut her hair short, started wearing boys' clothes, and asked to be called David from then on. The name David was chosen as a symbol of courage, like the biblical David who fought Goliath, reflecting the tremendous battle he had gone through. David also began the arduous process of medical detransition to become male again. Over the next few years, David underwent multiple surgeries. He had a double mastectomy to remove the breast tissue that had developed from years of estrogen. He underwent phalloplasty operations to construct a rudimentary penis using skin grafts. He started taking testosterone hormones. These procedures were grueling and painful, but David was determined to reclaim his body. By the late teens and early 20s, he was living fully as a young man. For a time, it seemed like David might finally find a bittersweet kind of happiness. In his early 20s, despite ongoing depression, David made efforts to build a new life. He fell in love, and in 1990, at age 25, he married a woman named Jane, becoming a husband and a stepfather to her 3 children. He was gentle and caring with the kids, perhaps in part because of all the suffering he knew from his own childhood. David found solace in simple pleasures. He enjoyed camping and fishing, and even worked modest jobs like in a slaughterhouse, trying to adjust to ordinary life. By outward appearances, he was a quiet, unremarkable man making the best of a traumatic past. David also decided to share his story with the world, hoping to prevent others from suffering the same fate. In 1997, he worked with Dr. Milton Diamond, a researcher who had long suspected the truth of David's case, to formally report the outcomes of the John Joan experiment. Their academic paper was published in the Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine, and it revealed that Money's celebrated case was actually a failure. This helped convince the medical community to stop performing sex reassignments on infants, with ambiguous genitalia as a knee-jerk solution. David then cooperated with journalist John Colapinto on a biography titled As Nature Made Him, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl, published in 2000. By speaking out, David displayed immense bravery. He turned his personal pain into a warning for others, exposing how Dr. Money's experiment had been a disaster that created psychological scars he could not overcome. For all his strength, however, David could not simply erase the past. He once likened his childhood to being brainwashed. It's torture, saying, "What they did to you in the body is nowhere near as bad as what they did to you in the mind." The trauma ran deep. He struggled with severe depression and anxiety, haunted by the ghost of an identity forced upon him. He had survived, yes, but not unscathed. In 2002, tragedy struck David's life again. His twin brother Brian, who had battled mental illness and drug addiction, died by an overdose in his 30s. Brian's death devastated David. Not only had he lost his closest lifelong companion, he also felt a crushing guilt, as if what happened to him, David, had somehow fed into Brian's troubles. David would go to his brother's grave every day, tending the site and weeping with regret. The weight of everything was becoming unbearable. On May 4th, 2004, the worst happened. David Reimer took his own life at the age of 38. After so many battles, his psychological pain and grief finally overwhelmed him. It was an ending no one had wanted. Not his loving wife, not his parents, and certainly not David himself, who had tried so hard to find peace. The world only learned David's real name and story in the wake of this tragedy. Previously he was known pseudonymously as John Joan. And with that, the full tale of Dr. Money's experiment became widely known. A cautionary tale, written in a family's tears. David's death underscored the stark truth. John Money's grand experiment had failed catastrophically. What had been hailed as a success in the 1970s was in fact a gender conversion that was far from successful, and ultimately a disaster that created psychological scars beyond what David could bear. In the end, nature triumphed over nurture. As the Los Angeles Times noted, Money's experiment actually proved the opposite of what he intended. It demonstrated the immutability of one's inborn sense of gender. No amount of social conditioning could make David truly become Brenda, because in his mind and identity he was always David. Anatomy was not destiny. Identity was. This story leaves us with profound questions about ethics, identity, and the human psyche. Psychologically, David Reimer's case has become a touchstone in understanding gender identity. David experienced what we now recognize as gender dysphoria, the intense distress of living in a body that does not match one's inner sense of self. Imagine the confusion of having everyone tell you you're a girl, when deep down you feel 100% like a boy. His suffering showed the world that gender identity has deep biological and developmental roots. It's not just something that can be taught or forced from the outside. The case also highlights how ethical lines can be crossed. When scientists and doctors become too blinded by their theories. Dr. Money was a respected expert, but he became so fixated on proving his hypothesis that he ignored clear evidence of harm. His refusal to admit error, even as Brenda David spiraled into crisis, is a stark reminder of the danger of arrogance in science and medicine. The Reimer family trusted the doctors, and they paid an unimaginable price. This tragedy urges today's professionals to approach intersex and gender-related cases with far more humility, compassion, and respect for the individual's feelings. Morally, David's story is heart-wrenching because no one involved wanted to do wrong. His parents were not malicious. They were young and scared, trying to do what doctors told them was best. Even Dr. Money did not set out to torture a child. He genuinely believed he might help Bruce Brenda and advance scientific understanding. But good intentions can lead to awful outcomes. When you lose sight of the human being at the center, David was treated like a test subject, rather than a child with his own innate needs. This raises enduring ethical questions. How far should we go in altering a child's identity for the sake of a theory? Who has the right to decide such things? David's life reminds us that respecting individual identity and autonomy is paramount. A person is not an experiment. Though David Reimer's life was tragically short, his legacy has had a lasting impact. His willingness to share his painful story brought crucial change. Thanks to David, the medical community re-evaluated practices for intersex infants and others, moving away from immediate surgery and gender reassignment in cases of ambiguous genitalia, opting instead for approaches that wait and consider the individual's own identity as they grow. In other words, no one else should have to go through what David went through. That is perhaps the one bittersweet positive. David's personal nightmare has saved countless others from a similar fate, as doctors now think twice before playing God with a child's identity. David's story also sparked public conversations about gender and nature versus nurture that continue to this day. It has been cited in psychology textbooks, documentaries, and articles as a sobering example of how complex and deeply rooted gender identity really is. For the broader world, David became an unwitting teacher. His life asks us to have empathy for those who struggle with identity and to approach differences with understanding rather than forcing conformity. In the end, the story of David Reimer is incredibly heartbreaking. One cannot help but feel for the little boy who never got to be himself, the teenager who finally learned the truth, and the man who tried so hard to build a normal life out of the wreckage of his childhood. It's a story of innocence lost, of a family tragedy, and of a scientific community learning a lesson at a terrible cost. David's courage in living as himself, even after everything that was done to him, is deeply moving. As we reflect on this tale, we might remember David's own words from an interview a few years before his death. You can never escape the past. You can deal with it, but it's always going to be there. He carried that past until he could carry it no more. We honor him by never forgetting what he went through, and by ensuring that children are loved and accepted for who they truly are. A thank you for watching and spending your time with us on this heavy but important journey. If this story moved you or made you think, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep, thought-provoking true stories. We appreciate your support and would love to have you with us for future videos. Until next time, stay kind and stay curious. I've left all the sources linked in the description if you want to check them out.